Yeah.
Hello, welcome.
The Cafe and Bone advertised itself as being Bone's music district. It wasn't until the third time I realized that it was in the middle of a residential neighborhood, but all the streets were named after composers. Hence the Cafe Mozart.
Okay. And there are a lot of cafe Mozarts in Central Europe.
Yes, but and a lot of composers to choose from.
So this, but this was not just a cafe, it was
It was a restaurant.
full-service restaurant.
And I just stumbled on it.
Yeah.
Found a good dish and Bone for a month.
So was it just a regular German soup, or was it flavored differently?
It was kind of a basic wash kind of stew.
You think it was peppered?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's been for 40 years. Well, not 40.
Well, you know, one of the reasons they may do that is because they're always trying to figure out how to put starches in, and there's just so many potatoes you can put in.
No,
And it's possible sometimes flour is cheaper.
I thought it was a marketing decision, as you said. How do you present this in a way that's interesting?
But it also is cheap.
As cheap.
And so I had,
Yep.
and then I had a meeting. Oh no, we finished, we got back to
You
it.
get decent bread from a decent bakery.
No, I had.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I couldn't leave.
Sister from another mission. Jesus, sister from another mission.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. All right, hi, welcome. Didn't mean to do that and then make y'all sit silently. Y'all trying to do hybrid as one person is a whole adventure. I'm slowly getting better at it.
3 devices going on. That's impressive.
All right, so welcome. I'm Sarah. I'm the pastor here at Green Street, and this is the 3rd installment of our Fall Voting series, where we are taking on social issues. I say both challenges and opportunities in the world around us, and asking what the Bible and theology have to tell us about these things, and vice versa. On Sunday mornings right now, we're doing a series called I Can Do All Things through a verse taken out of context, looking at commonly misquoted Bible verses, or just Bible verses that are well known but not really well known. And we will talk about a number of those tonight. So our topic for this evening is LGBTQ plus pride. And so I'm going to just start by naming that I am grateful to be in a place where I do not move through the world in a defensive posture about whether LGBTQ plus people should be included in the life of the church. This is no longer a question for me in my life, but it comes up. So we are going to spend a little bit of time at the start talking about what are sometimes referred to as the Clobber Verses. And these are verses in the Bible that are often used to exclude and condemn LGBTQ plus people. This is not the most interesting biblical or theological thing in this area, but it comes up a lot. And so I think it's important to address and equip people so that you know. I've had church members who somebody throws Romans 1:27 at them and they're like, oh my gosh, what? They don't know what to make of it. So we're going to talk about it briefly. And then we'll move on to more liberative and expansive scriptures and theologies that can help us think about all of this. So before we dive in, I've been every week having folks introduce themselves with some icebreaker question, and Allie had the great idea that since we're thinking about LGBTQ plus pride and the rainbow, that we share our favorite colors. So I have a friend who's 6-year-old right now says his favorite color is rainbow, and I love that. But so we can just go around, and we'll start with Allie, and she maybe has a second to think about it, but just your name and favorite color, and if you want to share anything else about yourself, that's also fine.
I'm Allie. My favorite color is teal.
Teal, nice.
Got one favorite color is blue.
I'm Cambria. My favorite color is neon green.
Neon green. And Cambria is our Salem College intern this semester and is going to be helping me out with some of our teaching and talking tonight. So I'm excited to hear from them.
My name's Caleb. My favorite color is olive green.
My name's Montana. My favorite color is blue.
My name's Luke, and I would say green. I'm J-Bo. My favorite color is like a leaf green.
Okay.
Awesome. Anyway.
My name is Tiff, and my favorite color is gold.
Gold.
I'm Laurie. My favorite color is like tarragon orange. I'm Elizabeth. My favorite color is sunshine yellow.
All right.
That's currently.
Lance, my favorite color is blue. Not too dark,
Nice and dark. Got it.
I'm Mike, and my favorite color is blue.
Blue.
My name is Gloria. My favorite color is phthalo blue, green shade.
Okay. All right.
My name is Lee, and currently my favorite color is green. Like a leaf green.
My name is Aquetta, and my favorite color is green. All greens. I love
Nice.
all
The rainbow of greens.
the rainbow.
My name is Lynn, and I can't believe I'm the only purple so far.
Oh,
Hi, I'm Kate. My favorite color is teal.
Oh, I got 2 teals.
My name is Shirley. I really can't say what my favorite color is because I love them all.
And my name's Reed, and I'm attracted to the color purple in her hair.
And I'm Sarah, and purple, specifically lavender, tends to be my favorite. Awesome, thank sharing that. And we've got Maris online says her favorite color is blue. And I feel obligated as a North Carolinian to distinguish between
Yes.
Carolina and
Yes,
but we maybe don't want to go down there. All right. Well, again, thank y'all for being here. And the last two of these that we've had have been really interactive, and it's been awesome. And so, if at any point you have a question or something you want to comment, be mindful of not taking up all of the time with a single comment. But you're welcome to interrupt me, raise your hand at any point. We welcome that very much. So. Okay, the Clobber Verses. So there are 6 verses in the entire Bible that are used to justify condemning and excluding LGBTQ plus people. That's it, 6. And we're going to talk again briefly about each of these. But basically, Genesis 19, which is Sodom and Gomorrah, Leviticus 18, 22, and 2013, that's where you get this terrible term, abomination. Romans 1, 26 to 27 is where we hear that this is against nature, which somebody was talking about what's natural or not earlier. We're going to talk a good bit about that. 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10, and 1 Timothy 1, 9 through 10. Spoiler alert, none of these are actually about what we're talking about. So, if you had to summarize the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, how would you summarize it? Recognizing I'm taking a risk by this.
I could try.
Go for it.
Okay. So isn't it like 2 angels or whatever you want to call them, who show up in the city? They are not shown hospitality in every way, and then therefore God condemns the city or cities. Yeah. Because they were not welcomed.
Awesome. Yeah, so we've already got the actual interpretation, which is that this story is about hospitality and not about sexuality. There's this line that people get hung up on where, so the angels, the messengers come, they're not welcomed initially, Lot welcomes them in, and the people of the city come and they say, let us have them so that we may know them. Now, knowing is one of these euphemisms in scripture for sexual acts. But this is clearly an instance of attempted rape, which has absolutely nothing to do with sex, period. It's about violence and domination and control. And that's what my slide says. So basically the sin of Sodom was a failure of hospitality. And, this is something I learned many years ago, but what I didn't really realize until recently was that there are other places in scripture that refer back to this story, and it is always in the context of talking about God's people's failure to uphold justice, hospitality, and care. There's no other verse that's inferring anything related to human sexuality into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So, Sodom and Gomorrah, about hospitality. There you go. Any questions before we move on? This is my least favorite part. Leviticus, there are these 2 verses that refer to lie. If you shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination. The second verse is pretty similar. When you get into the Hebrew, so translation is always an act of interpretation, right? Anytime we translate from any language, there are choices being made about what words are used. There's a lot in these that make it clear that it doesn't really have anything to do with sexual orientation, but there is this weird thing happening in the Hebrew where it talks about a male, there's a particular word being used. When it talks about a woman, it's actually using the word for wife. And so there's some of this is the structure of the grammar that is not what is common in Hebrew idioms. So in some ways, biblical scholars feel like we're missing something in the intent. There's also this reality that the word that gets translated as male can refer to a young boy. So as we'll see with a lot of these verses, what they're actually condemning is probably pedophilia or pederasty, which again has nothing to do with what we're talking about tonight. Also to think about, in this sermon series we're doing on Sundays, we're talking about context and putting verses back in context. Both of these verses are in larger passages that are warning against incest. So that's more the context. It's not about sexual orientation. And the word for abomination here, so that word is a heavy, heavy word in our language. When we say abomination, that sounds like, sin all the way down, something really horrible. But the word here really means cultural taboo. In Hebrew, it's toeva. And it might be something that maybe in the culture is looked down upon, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything about cosmic sin or it being evil, which abomination has that connotation of evil for us today, but that wouldn't have really been what this word meant in the time. And the real focus on these passages is delineating a cultural identity for the Israelites. And some people argue that the book of Leviticus is really more even just for the priests. But even if it is for all of the people, it's about forming a cultural identity in contrast with practices of other people groups around them as a marginalized group, as an oppressed group in that time. And so it's more about cultural practices than about sin or evil. Any questions?
Abomination doesn't carry the same weight as sin does in the Bible, right?
It depends on which word you're talking about.
How do you define abomination as in, I know they're each
Well,
one,
so
but
again, it goes back to the question of translation. So
Right.
the word that gets translated abomination here really means more like cultural taboo. Now there may be other places where it shows up, and this is something too that shows up in English translations of the Bible. The same word may pop up, but there's actually different Hebrew or Greek underneath, which can tell us sometimes that it's actually referring to different things, but we conflate those in our minds because we're reading it in English. That's
Right.
But just the weight of that word in translation is not really what the original context would have been.
there's a book that I've read. I've got the book. It's What the Bible Really Says About Homosexuality by Helmiak. That really interesting read.
Yeah, I got a couple books about that actually. So I actually just last night wrote this one's called Clobber Verses by Colby Martin, and a lot of it is kind of his story of coming out as a queer ally, which is fine, but the chapters about the Clobber Verses are actually pretty helpful if you really want to get into the weeds on some of the exegetical stuff around that. So I can show you all that. I'm trying to get through these quickly. So Romans 1:26-27 is one that comes up with these words. It seems to be talking about same-sex sex acts, using words like dishonorable, unnatural, shameless. So again, thinking about what do these words really mean in context. So the word that gets translated as dishonorable is atimia in Greek, and again, it means culturally shameful. So it's actually analogous to toeva, to the cultural taboo that comes up in Leviticus. Again, not making universal moral judgments about something. The other one, and this is where I will like nerd out all day, but I'll try to make it really chill. Unnatural. Okay. So this word already came up. Paraphusin is the Greek term that is used here, and Eugene Rogers is an author who is actually a professor at UMC Greensboro, which is cool. And his book After the Spirit is mostly pneumatology, theology of the Holy Spirit, but he has a chapter about paraphusin. He also has a whole book on sexuality in the Christian body, which I haven't read yet, but I'm told is a classic. But he talks about this phrase is often translated as contrary to nature. But really, think about the prefix para, paraclete. Para really means alongside rather than contrary to. And so the way Eugene Rogers translates this is he says this means in excess of nature. And then he points to, okay, what else in the Bible is in excess of nature? The incarnation, the resurrection, any miracle you want to name. So being in excess of nature is not inherently a bad thing and may actually be a unique revelation of God's goodness. So, and then lastly, shameless, the word that is translated there, really just means indecent. And in this context, what's being called shameless may be like public sex acts, which, you know, there are cultural reasons to say that might not be the best decision. But so that's some of what, again, in context, not actually talking about people's sexual orientation or gender identity. And just to note, because I haven't said it yet, the way that we talk about these things today, there would have been no concept of this in biblical times. There would have been understandings of you know, different kinds of personality or different kinds of acts, but when we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity today, these are modern categories that would be foreign to the biblical writers. So there's some of that going on. And I wanted to, in relation to the question about natural versus unnatural, this is a book of poetry by a queer, trans, non-binary Presbyterian minister named Slats. And they wrote this book of poetry called Queering Lent, where each day during Lent they wrote a poem. It's really lovely, and I'm going to read this poem. It's right there in this text you hold sacred, in this book you call good. The vision is a beautiful one, full of mystery and paradox and peace. The wolf and the lamb, the leopard and kid, the calf, the lion, the fatling, the cow and bear and all their children playing, living together, led by a child. How beautiful, you say, and paint paintings and sing songs and celebrate this vision. And it is beautiful. It is also unnatural. These instinctive relationships, these clearly established hierarchies, these unshakable binaries, predator, prey, built into DNA, built into the natural order, set aside for a higher purpose, peace. And you call us unnatural. You spit the word at us as an insult. We who redefine relationships and challenge hierarchies and break binaries. And so you come to our holy places to hurt and destroy us because you cannot see your vision of peace is queer. So we're going to talk a little bit more later about an author I'm reading who argues that Christianity is inherently queer, and we have lost this in our Western Platonic dualist way of approaching scripture and theology. The last couple are from 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy. This is where but we get these terms that get translated often homosexual or homosexuality. It depends on the translation that you're working with. But this is often where people go where they say, it's right there in the Bible that it says that homosexuals shall not enter the kingdom of God. Well, okay, translation, interpretation. The two terms being used here are malakoi and arsenokoitai. I did not take Greek in seminary, so I am always faking it when I read Greek to y'all. The word malakoi means soft. Sometimes it's used in regards to fabric, but it can mean weak, spineless. Derogatorily, it can mean an effeminate man. As a reminder, misogyny is alive and well, and patriarchy is alive and well in Scripture. But sometimes it can refer to pederasty. So again, there's this implication that we might miss that we're talking about inherently non-consensual relationships between adults and young boys. Arsenokoitai is a word that Paul might have made up, which I only recently learned, which is kind of interesting. So there's not really clear context or references to understand exactly what it means. But in broader context in this verse, it looks like it's talking more about sexual exploitation. So his focus is more on honoring one's body and on the bodies of others, not with any given person's sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. And those are all of the Clobber verses. Any questions about those?
Moving right along.
Yeah, right. And again, like if you really do want to dig into more resources around these, I could definitely refer you to more. It's just, I have just come to feel strongly that staying so focused on this question of justification, we just miss so much. So
I do have a question.
Yeah, but
how did it become? What is the word clobbering? Like,
it means to like hit, right?
Okay.
But yeah, so the Clobber verses or the Clobber passages are used to beat people over the head with the Bible, specifically about human sexuality. So to talk, unclobber is the name of that book, so I've just stolen his term. But there are so many passages in Scripture where we can find queer vision. In just a minute, Cambria is going to talk some about Genesis and the creation stories. Think about the story of Ruth and Naomi, of how this mother lost her sons and her daughters-in-law. One of them went back to her family, as was the custom, and the other said, no, I will stay with you. Well, this was completely against cultural practice and an act of finding found family, which is a practice that LGBTQ folks keep up in a lot of ways. In 2 Samuel 1, we've got stories of David and Jonathan. There's been a lot of speculation today as to the nature of their relationship, but there's this profound love between two men that shows up in 2 Samuel. In Acts 8, we have the story of Ethiopian eunuch who was both an ethnic and gender sexual minority who was baptized, and it was, it's this beautiful scene where he's talking to Philip, and then he says, "Here is water. What is to stop me from being baptized?" And the answer is essentially nothing. And he goes on his way rejoicing, never being required to change anything about himself. Right? Galatians 3. Actually, Pastor Courtney is going to preach about that this coming Sunday. This is where we read, "There's no longer male nor female, no longer Jew nor Greek, free, all of this." These are binaries that we're going to talk about how we can blow those up a little more. But there's just a lot in Scripture. We tend to focus so much on the Clobber passages as being what's about human sexuality and queerness, when there's just a lot more there that we can dig into if we calculate that. So I'm going to turn it over to Cambria for a little bit now. He's going to talk about Genesis.
So, this is kind of a new translation that I found on a special trip to Half Price Books, and I loved it a lot. So, generally, we have Genesis 1, which is going to say, "So God created humans in this image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them." Initial reactions are that normally solidifies the gender binary. I've had it used against me many times. But in this translation, Elohim created the groundling in His image, created it in the image of Elohim, male and female created them. So we're seeing like this groundling, this beautiful being, right? And male and female is creating this kind of spectrum. It's not necessarily a binary. We're gonna have like A to Z. You're talking about the whole alphabet, but it is definitely presented in 2 letters. We don't just have 2 letters, we have a whole alphabet. So like, we have male and female, we have a whole spectrum of gender here, and it's written right there. Earlier in the creation story, God created the morning and the evening. God created everything in between, it's not just the 2. So that's a really great way to look at it. So when we're claiming that these are like just 2 things, not true. We have a whole spectrum. But this is not just about like humans. I really like to look at the way that it talks about God. So, what thoughts there? How is that a reaction of maybe God is seen in this verse in a different gendered way? Anybody? Yes.
Well, one of the things that's missed when we read this in English is Adam sounds like a man's name, but Adam means from the earth. And so the name is not intended to be a man's name at all. And so the first creature that's created, human creature that's created, is not a man, it's not a woman. It's just human. And it will, of course, become the source of all other humans, but it's not a man. And that's really important. And of course, the implication of that is because God is creating this creature, human creature, in His own image, or her own image, their own image, probably is the right pronoun right now. The implication is that God is not a man either.
So, like, if God is the image, right, then we have male and female and everything in between and beyond.
All humanness.
Exactly. Then you have a genderful God. That is what we're seeing. And that's really beautiful. And to what you said, Adam, that is what here is groundling. This is like a creature that is not necessarily gendered. Right before the creation of Eve from the rib, a lot of people historically have read that as one genderful being, androgynous kind of being. I have it pulled up. Actually, and so in Jewish Midrash from like 300 CE, we have rabbis saying that this is an androgynous being. This isn't necessarily like a new way of thinking. In the way that we're thinking about it, it's kind of new. in like a trans non-binary type of sensibility. But we have a rabbi saying, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgen. As it is said, male and female, he created them. So you have this historical being that is encompassing all of it. And, you know, that is a well-held opinion for a long time. Any other thoughts on this? Yeah.
I just want to clarify what I think you're saying is that God created male and female as a spectrum, and that, like, what you just read is to say that the first human wasn't really gendered at all. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what I thought you were saying before is that the pronoun him or he is referring to God, and God created male and female in the image of Elohim, and Elohim, even though his image is used, male and female were created in Elohim's image, so that Elohim has to be more than just a pronoun him in order to hold. So you're saying both things?
I would say, from a personal standpoint, in my personal belief in pronouns, is that I would say that God would use all pronouns, because while you can think of God as gender neutral, I think gender all-encompassing is a really good way of thinking of it. If God is creating male and female and all the others, then that is within the capacity of God to hold it all. And so very divinely full of gender. So yeah.
Distinction between genderless and genderfluid.
Yes, exactly. So I would say any pronouns are welcome for God, in my belief. That is what I have on Genesis.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Cambria, and I love, those images of day and night, but there's also dusk and dawn, male and female, and there's everything in between.
Yeah.
And this is part of Hebrew rhetorical devices, right? We hear, I'm going to say Hebrew, but then I'm going to say some Greek stuff. So the Alpha and the Omega, that means that God is all-encompassing, because Alpha and Omega are the beginning and end of the Greek alphabet. This is a common thing in Scripture, that when we say two things on the end of a Bible, we mean everything in the middle. But in our modern Western sensibilities, we're very attached to binaries and to either or, and so we miss this a lot in Scripture. So I'm reading a book that is really cool, and I'm not done with it, so here's me presenting what I've read in the first two chapters. So I'm reading this book called Queer Virtue by Elizabeth Edmond, who is a queer Episcopal priest who was very active during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, caring for folks advocating for queer people in that time. And her book is basically arguing, in part, that Christianity is inherently queer, and that it's not just that Christianity has something to offer to LGBTQ+ people, but that there is a lot that Christianity can and should learn from queerness. So she says for herself, her queer identity has taught her more about how to be a good Christian than has the church. And she makes this argument that I think is really interesting, that just having the lived experience of a queer person in this society means that there has to be a lot of intentional reflection around ethics and morals, because you're bombarded with judgments about these things all the time, right? So that there is sort of within the queer, and any given person of any sexual orientation or gender identity can have their moral flaws, right? But just that the world we live in motivates this ethical consideration in a profound way within the LGBTQ community. And I thought that was really interesting, the way that she framed that, and it made a lot of sense to me, that there are a lot of things that sort of in the world of cis heterosexuality, there's a lot that we take for granted or don't look at. The question of kind of, when did you know you were gay? Well, nobody asks, when did you know you were straight? But there is this reflection that is a part of it. I really like what she talks about, how the lessons of queer identity help other Christians better understand their faith. And she says that she talks about how, there's sometimes this assumption that, if only LGBTQ people were welcomed more into the church, they would get so much from Christianity. And maybe that's true, but she really argues that actually it's in the reverse, that there's a need, that Christianity needs queer people in order for the church to become its best self. And I love that. She also says that Christianity is inherently queer. And to define it, she says, queer as something that has at its center an impulse to disrupt any and all efforts to reduce into simplistic dualisms our experience of life, of God. This reminded me, there's a bell hooks quote where she talks about queerness, not just as about who you have sex with, but about that same disruption, that being at odds with the power structures. And Edmund lists these kind of basic tenets of Christian faith, and then argues that they are inherently queer. So she talks about how in Christianity we believe that God became human, that there is this connection between God and humanity, and that is inherently breaking the binary, that we think of God and humanity as completely opposites, completely separate, and yet in the incarnation we have both, fully human, fully divine. We as Christians have this access to the divine in a way that breaks that binary. She also talks about life and death, as these are kind of considered opposites or a binary, but we have here the resurrection, we have these miraculous healings, this sort of image of Jesus traveling through death back into life, again, breaking a binary. And then Christianity is inherently transgressing ethnic, nationalistic, and familial boundaries. So a lot of religions are very tied to those things and have been over time, but Christianity from its earliest days, it started within a faith like that, started as basically a Jewish movement, and then it expanded beyond those boundaries in a way that it is, again, breaking binaries. So to her, she says that this means Christianity is inherently queer, and that when we think about it that way, there's an expansiveness and a liberation there for all people. So sometimes we think about, well, it's queer people who need to be liberated. Well, really, just the question, are the straights okay? No. Everybody needs to be liberated from heteronormativity. Alok Menon has a great video where they talk about how the gender binary harms everybody, and that we all need to be liberated from the confines of the gender binary. Let me see if I have another slide. All right, so that's all that I have presentation-wise, but I would love to have some conversation for the last 15 or so minutes that we have. Gloria.
Viktor Orban, the current head of the government in Hungary, says he's a Christian nationalist, and one of the things that he identifies as Christian nationalism is not wanting immigrants. And this is so bizarre to me. I can't even get my head around it. And so I'm wondering, is there any way you can get your head around this or explain it, or is it just nonsense?
Come back in 3 weeks. So I actually meant to mention that even as I say that, Christianity goes beyond these boundaries. Obviously, there are Christian nationalist movements, and there have been. There was the German Christian movement in Nazi Germany was very real. We see Christian nationalism hard at work in the service of white supremacy here in America. We see it abroad. So we have a whole Christian nationalism week planned for a couple of weeks from now, where we're going to dig into that. I do think it's a perversion of the faith itself and completely misses some of the most important aspects of it. So, yeah. Jordan.
So tonight we're just talking about not the justification. We use the word justification, but that crux of tension of where Christianity has said, like.
Well, I think I started there, but I'd like to, we can talk more about that if we need to, but I'd like to have it broader than that. Okay. Because I think there is also sometimes this assumption that if we can just get those arguments right, then everything will be okay. But there is real repentance needed on the part of the church and real repair needed for all of us. And so, I don't know, I'm interested in whatever y'all want to bring, but in thinking kind of about how we as Christians approach the gender binary, heteronormativity, all of these things, and liberate ourselves from them as people of faith.
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because my question was not about
Well, if you
the
have,
format.
I mean,
Yeah, I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure that, I wasn't gonna throw us out into a different discussion, but, so I was really glad to be here Sunday and have you talk about the history of the United Methodist Church. And I shared this past Sunday that I didn't grow up UMC, like this is like my first time ever really worshiping in the youth. So like the liturgy, all of that is very, very new. For me, my background is very diverse in terms of where I have worshiped before, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, like the most immediate. But in, I guess it was 2016, in my memory it was around 2017, 2018, like when I remember what was happening with the UMC, I started these conversations around faith, sex, and sexuality. Because I was working in communities in which I was in relationship with people that went to UMC churches. And so these conversations, I thought, would be an opportunity to bring people's experiences into the room instead of judgments. And let's just talk about the experience of what we have learned from our faith and how that has translated into our bodies and the ways that we understand sex, and then the expression of the sex in terms of our sexuality. And so I would love to learn or to be in the space of conversing about how do we understand all of these different theologies that regulate our bodies, no matter how we interact our bodies with. And like, what does that change when we talk about any of the conversations in terms of sexuality or identification?
Yeah, all great questions. I have a lot of thoughts about other people. Sure. But yeah, thank you.
I was at a meeting a couple of years ago where we were talking about homosexual, prejudice against gay people in Christian churches. And a couple of women said that they were afraid in their church. And I was kind of shocked because, the idea that you could go to church and feel afraid because of who you are just seems so contrary to, what the whole thing is supposed to be about. And I don't know, how do we even deal with that? If people apparently in Winston-Salem can, feel afraid to go to church on Sunday, and so they don't go.
There are people who won't come here because we're part of a denomination that discriminates against people, and I get that. I'm still here for my reasons, but I support people doing what they need to do to feel safe and accepted, and recognize the church has not been a safe place for a lot of people.
Could you talk more about what it means and explain? See, I'm heterosexual and I'm 75, so I can see in like the political arena why people feel really violated and afraid. But how does this happen in church? Is it because the minister stands up there and degrades people who are gay? That's what it's about? Or are there other things too?
There's a lot, yeah. So that happens. It is this interaction of Christianity, politics, patriarchy, all of this. I'm sure I know where to start in terms of where does it come from. I was maybe other people have thoughts.
Yeah, I was gonna say on a day-to-day level, I think it looks like a lot of like exclusion and posture. Yeah, so it's not getting invited, not feeling welcome, but also like people actively like, commenting on your lifestyle or whatever in a way that's not like building you up or like even helpful, but in a way that's like more akin to bullying.
Okay.
And that's not even necessary. Just not talking about it at all is enough. Just not addressing it, just ignoring it entirely is enough to make people not feel comfortable because they're operating on all of the assumptions that they have from their own upbringing, perhaps in the church, or what, it doesn't take much to hear about how, in general, the church treats gay people. So you don't even need to have grown up in the church to know that, and then you go to a church one time, and, or you know, a couple times, and they don't talk about it, or they aren't like, you know, then it's just so deep. So it's not enough to just, well, anybody can come here, and that's just a vague kind of, oh yeah, well, we welcome all people. No, you have to be directly welcoming to all different groups.
Yeah,
There's also
evidence of safety, there's only evidence of unsafety.
Yeah.
Right, that's the baseline assumption, because that is not the truth.
Exactly.
There's a good book in the church office that Ken has a copy of, and it's written by Julie Wood, who goes to this church, and it is a heartbreaking story of her son's struggle through the Christian church and his ultimate suicide, because he was really essentially ostracized and told there was something wrong with him and that he had to change, and it's so, it just, I get goosebumps just thinking about it. But it's a good read, and I didn't even know she was affiliated with this church until I got to the last chapter. I was like, oh, you know, she goes to Green Street. It's called Changing the Message, and it gives a lot of insight into what happened with the church and her son, and then watching this happen. And it was the youth leader of the church, and I mean, it was just.
It was very direct and explicit.
Yeah,
There was no
implication.
No.
They've got a very
Yeah.
explicit attack,
Yeah.
condemnation.
So
Not everybody gets the explicit attack and condemnation, but it's still there unless it is actively countered. I think about it kind of like how Ibram Kendi talks about anti-racism, that it's like you're either racist, because that is the baseline of where we are in this country, or you're actively being anti-racist. Within the Christian church, there's been a culture of patriarchy, misogyny, and homophobia and transphobia. And so unless that's why we try to be so loud about it at Green Street, is because we know we have to be actively working on it, or else we're participating in the harm that's ongoing.
What I'm hearing people say is that churches are really intimate communities. I mean, you know a lot about one another, and people, I guess, feel free to say what they think, which may be really cool.
It really depends on the church.
Well, but I mean, a church can often be described as a family, and then that may make people feel that they have permission to say whatever is on their mind, even if it's cool.
Abusive families.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like I've experienced it in terms of, I won't go to church in my mom's home church because it is preached in a pulpit. So it's like an attack on me when I'm going into a church, and this is what is preached. You know what I'm saying? So it's sort of, that is very explicit, and it is just what it has always been. There's no change, there's no try to change, and the idea is that it's similar to what you were saying in the black nice jacket, that there's also, like, we can accept you as long as you stay in the closet, right? Like, as long as you don't, as long as you're not out and you're not doing what you want, like, you're not being authentically you.
Right. So it's like you can't be in the family.
Yeah.
You can be in the periphery, but you really can't come in our family because you don't.
Because you're
Because you can't celebrate. I mean, celebrating is part of family, or what's family's supposed to be.
There's also such a strong thing in the churches that I've grown up in. Like, I actively know people who are queer who cannot serve in the church, cannot operate, cannot, if they want to even continue to go to the church and be in any kind of good standing, they stay celibate. This is so much harm is continually perpetuated in spaces that aren't actively combating that. And it isn't a rare thing to find. It's very, I feel, quite across the board. Again, I can't speak for everyone, but that is something that, again, actively know people in my own real life that are in this space.
And if I could speak to basically where you started of like, they're not in the church. I think a lot of us have left the church to find Jesus.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
because what we're talking about here with binaries and stuff, and we're like, wait, we're not seeing the fullness of God here. And so that's why I left, because I was like, there's something missing here. I'm being microaggressed every day. That doesn't seem like the God of the Bible. And so I was like, well, I guess I gotta go out. And it is kind of foolish to think that he would just be in the church. Like, he is out there. So I know that's why I have left the church. And I want to come back, but it's not safe all the time. So that's kind of.
Well, I
Can you
think-
speak specifically to what you were saying? We're like, okay, so I'm going to a church that is outwardly and actively working to combat these things. Someone could still come in and be a part of this church and say things that are hurtful to people. What do you do about that? I mean, I don't know. Try and love them and welcome them, and like if they continue to spout malice. I mean, I know there are parts of the Bible that kind of give instruction or advice on what to do when somebody is bringing hate into that space. If that person can't really be a part of this family, then and that's really hard too. But yeah, I mean that even a space that is very actively working to include people and welcome the outcast, really the societal outcast, the church outcast. You might still get someone who is freely speaking, and you want that, and like if it's and you hope that what they're saying is out of ignorance or and that they're willing to learn and to be like, oh wow, that was okay, you're reacting that way to me, that was a really bad thing of me to say or hurtful or wrong or and willing to be willing to have that conversation. So I mean I think that like most LGBTQ plus people have had to have moments or had like that I can't count the number of times that I'm sure like if someone has said something to them and they've had to like help teach that person it's beyond yeah.
We got fun stories like that.
Yeah.
Justify your existence right now.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah.
Why?
Could also talk about issues of governance, who has a seat at the table. Like, you have a board of directors, does it include queer people? Which is.
And a lot of churches, no,
Or just all
or women.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah. I guess
Well,
there are.
and it goes back to a question of power, and so it's it's something that I think a lot about is we say all are welcome at Green Street. Do we mean if someone came in spouting homophobic, transphobic things? Well, okay, like maybe, but we're going to figure out who's going to talk to that person.
Right.
We might not take our most freshly traumatized queer person and say, go teach them why it's okay. No, we're not going to do that. But we're also going to recognize that that person has power in society that LGBTQ folks don't. And that has to be acknowledged. I think a lot of times it's treated as this both sides kind of thing, as if these are people or groups of equal power that just have to duke it out. And that is not what's happening. We're talking about people who are marginalized, oppressed, who experience violence, both verbal and physical, and otherwise spiritual violence. And that is something that I see a lot of moderate churches trying to sort of both sides things. And that's just not how it really works. There is always grace for people to, to learn and to do better and to grow. But figuring out kind of who has the calling and the wherewithal to do that work, right? We can't put all of that labor, just like I can't expect Black people to teach me everything about race. I can't ask that labor of oppressed groups, but neither can I speak for other people, right? It's this tension, but that is something that I think Green Street tries to wrestle with. Surely.
My question is, are people born gay, or is this just something that happens throughout life? I mean, how did this all come about?
I think that if you asked 100 people, you would get 100 different answers.
Okay.
And I will say that's actually something that has been a learning edge for me in recent years, that, for a long time there was this emphasis on people are born this way, they, et cetera, which is fine and great. But also, autonomy and choice matter. We talked about that last week. Being able to choose and have agency in gender expression, in who you're in relationship with. I think that's actually an important piece of the conversation, that sometimes when we say that, oh, they're just born this way, that doesn't actually take away the stigma sometimes, and it doesn't take away the more moralism around the conversation. So, you know, I guess yes, but I would ask somebody about their experience of it. I would take any other different responses around that. But I also think if we're talking about kind of how the gender binary and heterosexuality are kind of imposed on us by society, I think again there's this assumption that that's the baseline, that that's what's natural. When really, if we think about, you know, the first human created was genderful, we are all on a spectrum somewhere when it comes to gender and sexuality. Some of us are more aware of and in tune with it than others. So, you know, that's what I think is probably more important, that it's not that some people are different, but that we are all on the spectrum, but we live in a society that puts us on one end or another of binary.
Oh, kind of you bringing up like people argue that it's natural. Like actually really interesting, there's a book called Queer Ducks. I've heard of it. It's like a more recent book, and it's all this research about queerness in the animal kingdom, and nature is incredibly queer. And it's actually like coming out that like in the 18th century, for centuries, that has been known by scientists, but because of societal things, that's been hidden by scientists. And so, again, we use that narrative to perpetuate like oppression and the narrative of like homosexuality and queerness isn't natural, when actually it is incredibly natural, like in the rest of the world, in the rest of nature.
Yeah.
So,
and even in, you know, we're talking about colonialism in a couple of weeks, but there are cultures that were destroyed or coerced by Western imperialism that had, you know, a deep, rich understanding of an expansive view of gender and sexuality that was stamped out by colonizers, right? So this is also something that has been deeply a part of human history that we like to deny or overlook.
It's like being like the anti-evolve. Humans like to regress in evolution.
Yes, unfortunately. Well, it's just past 8, so we try to keep it to about an hour, but if anybody has anything else they want to say, thank y'all for participating in this conversation, and I can't remember what we're talking about next.
Clobber Verses.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, it wasn't you. Yes, so that's, so Courtney is going to be preaching on Galatians 3:28, and she told me that verse was used basically to, as she was growing up, to tell her to put her Christian identity above her blackness and not to take too much pride in being a black woman. So I'm super excited to hear her sermon about this. And then we're going to talk more about race and how, again, thinking about power, we like to say, oh, we don't see color. But anyway, we'll be talking about that next week. Joy.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, please do. Please.
Thank you. In response to your question about are people born gay or not, I loved your response to that. So thank you so much, Sarah, for putting in the word choice. So I also have a public health background, and there was time where I spent time in Mali, which is on the western coast of the continent of Africa. And while there was some HIV work that I was also, like, before going there, engaged in. And a part of the strategy is that we couldn't use the word gay or homosexual because those were foreign terms. These were men who were having sex with men, but also had several wives or had a wife and had children. But the act of having sex with men, which was why the HIV epidemic was like going so rampant within this particular area, it's because they were just thinking, I'm expressing my sexuality. It wasn't like, oh, I'm gay and so I'm having relations with my boyfriend or my husband or like. So I think in having this conversation, it also helps to understand how do other people think of sexuality, of the particular act, and not necessarily the names that we call it, but like, let's look at the what are we talking about? And then looking at other experiences, I think that can also be, at least it was very helpful for me, because I grew up very conservative, rural Black church, having like no pants, skirts, like, yeah, I'll just stop there, but I was really grateful to hear.
Yeah. Thank you, Joy. Awesome. Thank you all so much. I would love for y'all to come back next week or the week after.